Hello and welcome to the Parent Carer Workshop. My name is Kaylee and today I'm going to be talking to you about autism and sensory differences. So before we start out, it's important to remember that all of the information provided in this presentation is general information about autism and how this presents in children, based on both research and my own personal experience of working with autistic children. So you may find that not all of this information applies to your child, and that is because all children with an autism diagnosis present differently, depending on where they are fluctuating on their spectrum. So we always try to say that once you've met one child with autism, you've only met one child with autism. So please hold that in mind when watching this presentation. If you do have any questions whilst watching the information and would like clarification on anything, then please do email the email address on the screen, which is the autism service at cognus.org.uk, and someone will be in response to your query. Throughout our everyday life, we are exposed to a large amount of sensory stimuli, and this information travels into our brain where it is processed in order for us to make sense of this. For example, recognising if it is sunny and perhaps we need to wear sunglasses, or if we're touching something that is hot and to signal us to move away from this. The way this information is processed can work differently for autistic people, meaning that they may experience the world differently. The way that a child behaves is a form of communication in itself and can be very informative in letting other people know how they are feeling. Sometimes this is not always clear, but when a child is exhibiting extreme behaviour, we can think, what are they trying to tell us? So going back to your child's sensory system, as I mentioned at the start, autistic people may interpret sensory information in a different way, meaning they may experience impaired feedback. So this may make their sensory system feel out of balance and they may engage in behaviours to try and increase or decrease the feedback they are receiving to help try to self-regulate. So it may seem an easy option to try and stop sensory seeking behaviours, but if the child is not able to meet their sensory needs, then this will most likely result in them finding less desirable behaviours in order to meet these needs. So for example, if you notice your child biting their cuff or their sleeve, you may think about them wearing short sleeves to try and stop this. However, if your child still needs to perform the action of biting because this is soothing for them, then they may revert to perhaps biting their arm in order to still fulfill this need, which would be a less desirable behaviour compared to biting their cuff of their jumper. So just holding this in mind could be really useful. So here is a video demonstrating how someone with autism may process the sensory environment around them. So this video I think is a great representation of what it feels like to be sensory overloaded. So the child with autism was picking up on sounds from all different directions, and sounds perhaps other people wouldn't even hear. So I think this just shows how uncomfortable it can be for a child with autism to be surrounded and overwhelmed by and overloaded by different sensory inputs. So we have mentioned how autistic people may interpret sensory information differently due to their sensory processing system. So people could have either a high and or low neurological threshold. So firstly, let's start with a high neurological threshold. So this is where people are hyposensitive. They are underreactive and tend to be sensory seeking because they're not receiving enough sensory information that is getting through to their processing system, meaning they may have to seek out more extreme sensory behaviours in order to feel something. For example, this is where you might see your child head banging because they may not be able to feel a light tap on their head. They need to engage in a more extreme force of behaviour to feel something. On the other end of the scale, this is where we have low neurological threshold, and this is where people are hypersensitive. So they are sensitive to the stimuli around them as it feels as though too much information gets through. So, for example, someone with autism who has a low neurological threshold, they may have to wear ear defenders because their ears are oversensitive to the sound and they can hear sounds louder than perhaps they are. So let's just keep this in mind when thinking about each sense individually. So traditionally we have 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, taste and smell. However, as research has developed, we now include 3 other senses, these being vestibular, proprioception and interoceptive. So we will talk in more detail about what these senses are as we continue through this presentation. So let's start by looking at the vestibular sense. So this is the sense of balance and means that you can cope with gravity when you are moving, no matter what direction or speed. So this is the sense that stops you from falling over when you bend down to pick something up. Posture and muscle tone also depend on the signals interpreted from the middle ear via the vestibular system. So let's now have a look at how this may present differently in both hypo and hypersensitive individuals. So hyposensory seekers, this is where you may see perhaps a child rocking back and forth, leaning side to side, spinning around, and displaying sensory experiences that challenge the centre of gravity. So, for example, swinging back and forth on the swing. Hypersensory individuals, this is where you may see a child showing difficulty changing direction, so changing sudden direction when they're running, difficulty maintaining their speed, and trouble walking and balancing. So these are just the differences between hypo and hypersensory individuals and how this may impact their vestibular sense. So next we're going to take a look at the proprioceptive system, which has a very close relationship to the vestibular system. So proprioception refers to the awareness of your body's position and movement. So the proprioceptive system receives information from all your joints, muscles and tendons, which in turn then helps the body to adjust its position and to allow for smooth movements with just the right amount of pressure. The proprioceptive system then informs the brain where the body is in time and space in relation to everything else that's around it. So proprioception is important for motor planning as long as the information that it's receiving is accurate. So again, depending on the sensory system of the individual, they may respond in different ways. So firstly, let's look at hyposensitive individuals. So these are the individuals who seek out behaviours in order to receive the information, as not enough information is getting through to their senses. So therefore, in relation to the proprioception sense, you may see a child needing to touch everything that they see, perhaps leaning on surfaces or other people, laying on the floor and craving contact from other people. And this is because they're not receiving enough information from their proprioceptive sense, so they need to engage in other behaviours in order to feel this. On the other hand, hypersensitive individuals will try to avoid behaviours as too much information is getting through and making them at times feel uncomfortable. So for example, they may be sensitive to touch, so even a small touch may feel painful for them. Or perhaps they may take their clothes off as these feel quite restrictive or quite heavy on their skin. or they may walk on their tiptoes because walking flat-footed may cause pain. So all of these behaviours we've discussed relate to the proprioceptive sense, and these behaviours you may have noticed in your child. So it's useful to hold this in mind, and that it could be related to this sensory need. So next, let's look at the visual sense. So what might this look like for a child with autism? So as we have mentioned in the previous parent-carer workshops, many children with autism tend to be visual learners, but not all. So the use of visuals can be useful to aid understanding, learning and communication. So looking at the slides now, the first point we have is visual eye contact for a child with autism, and this can sometimes be limited. So some autistic children can have that difficulties using direct focus, especially at faces. So therefore, when talking to the child with autism, it may be better to have an activity perhaps to focus on the middle of the two of you, rather than having a conversation face to face, because the face-to-face conversation requires eye contact, and this can be quite difficult and anxiety provoking for a child with autism. So perhaps having an activity in between the two of you, you can both focus on this activity and have a conversation which isn't being stunted by that awkward eye contact or what is causing the child some increased anxiety. Next, we have focusing on small objects in the room. So children with autism may focus on specific details or items within a room. So this means they may find it quite difficult to look at the whole picture due to being fixated on the smaller details. So I know I mentioned that before in a previous parent-carer programme about how when you have a whole picture, someone with autism may just focus on that small detail. So if we have a picture of a sea nest of a duck pond, they may really focus in on the features and the details of one single duck in that duck pond. So again, that comes back to that visual sense. And due to this, individuals then may insist on certain visual orders before being able to complete a task such as schoolwork. So they may have to order their belongings on the tabletop, perhaps placing resources or other visual distractors out of the way so that they can help their concentration and their focus. It has also been shown that some autistic children may only use their peripheral vision, so the sight out of their corner of their eyes. So alternatively, these children may not see what's directly in front of them. So you may see a child with autism therefore squinting or looking out of the corner of their eyes, as this is what is their strongest part of their visual sense. Finally, strong visual preferences may extend to only using certain colours, letters or numbers. So for children with autism, you may be able to aid their learning by having the worksheets printed on a certain colour of paper, because this is their strong visual preference, and they're able to focus and concentrate a lot more when the information is presented in this way or this form. So again, these are all important points to remember, and just something to hold in mind that these behaviours may be related to the visual sense and the sensory needs of the child. So next we move on to the auditory sense, and we're going to think about how this might look for a child with autism. So firstly, we have putting hands over the ears, which is quite an obvious sign of auditory overload for the child. So this is to help block out noises due to their hearing system being oversensitive. So going back to what we spoke about earlier, being oversensitive to noises mean that the child is on the hypersensitive side. So this may mean that some noises, perhaps often sudden and loud noises, can cause an overreaction which may seem perhaps disproportionate to the impact we may have thought it would cause to the child. But because of their oversensitive auditory system, this will cause quite a large effect to their hearing and what they're perceiving this noise to be like. So also, if the child is hypersensitive to sounds, then they may also hum or sing to try and screen out other noises that they can hear, as these other sounds are hard to tolerate and can also in a way be causing quite a lot of pain for the child. Alternatively, if your child is hyposensitive to sounds, so they may be showing behaviours such as putting their ears close to noises in order to listen, perhaps seeking out loud noises, turning the radio up really loud, turning the TV up loud, just because they want to be able to hear something. Not enough auditory information is getting through to their ears, so they're seeking out those louder noises. So therefore, it's beneficial to think about your child's environment and the noise level, as this may be impacting them and then impacting them on their behaviour. So it's just useful to hold this in mind, especially if you start to see your behaviour, your child engaging in some of these behaviours, such as covering their ears, just thinking about what's going on in the environment around them. Is it too noisy for them? And then thinking about how can you adjust the environment? Could it be a case of providing your child with ear defenders or turning down loud noises, going into a quieter area? So we're going to touch on this a bit more as we go through, but they're just points to think about and hold in mind. So now we're going to spend some time moving on and thinking about the tactile sense, which is also known as touch. So we're going to think about this in the context of autism and how this sense may differ for autistic children. So firstly, we're going to start by looking at the hyposensitive individuals. So these are the children who perhaps aren't receiving enough information from their tactile sense. So behaviours we may see from these children, they may engage in behaviours such as liking a firm massage or tight squeezing hugs. So they may use firmer touch techniques as they need these to be harder in order for their sensory systems to process this. Also, these are children who may engage in perhaps rougher play, or perhaps they don't know their own strength, and that's because they find it difficult to feel how hard they're touching other people. So if you see your child engaging in this rougher play, again, just thinking back that this may be related to that undersensitive tactile sense, and just to hold that in mind. On the other hand, we have the hypersensitive individuals. So this is where too much information is getting through. So therefore, we may see behaviours such as stripping off clothing or cutting labels out of clothes because this feels too uncomfortable and sometimes painful for the child. So the light feel of clothes can feel very harsh and heavy for a child with autism. Some individuals report liking softer, least restrictive clothes, for example, sweatshirts and jogging bottoms, as this puts less pressure on their skin. We also might see an overreaction to light touch, such as a gentle touch of the shoulder, which you might use to comfort a child. And again, this may be perceived as quite a heavy touch and more like a hit, rather than a gentle touch, and can be perceived as painful. And that's because too much of that tactile information is getting through to their processing system, which makes them perceive that that is a harder touch than perhaps you intended. So again, I think it's useful just to hold all this in mind, as some of these behaviours we may not always think relate to a sensory need, but they do. And for something that is perceived as uncomfortable or even painful for a child due to their sensory needs, and we can just make small adjustments to help relieve this discomfort. So moving on, we now have taste and smell sense. So some behaviours we may have seen in autistic children include having strong preferences or dislikes of a particular taste or smell. So this includes perhaps being a fussy eater. So you may have noticed your child will only eat a few different types of food or likes to take the same packed lunch each day. Thinking about dinner times, are you making your child the same dinner or a separate dinner to what the rest of the family are eating? Also thinking about placement of food on the plate. Do they like to have their food touching, or perhaps you're maybe using dividers so your child's food is not touching? And these are all quite typical behaviours of an autistic child in relation to their taste and smell sense. So this can relate back to a sensory need associated with taste and smell, and could be an underlying issue for refusals. So another behaviour you may have noticed your child performing is sniffing objects, food, or even people. So they may be able to notice smells that you cannot smell due to their hypersensitive sense of smell. So again, this just highlights the different behaviours you may notice within your child and how it can be related to a sensory need. So again, that oversensitive smell may come back to being able to smell their jumper in their classroom and knowing which one belongs to them and which one belongs to their friend, just by that sense of smell. So these are all behaviours that you may see an autistic child engage in, and just something to hold in mind that and how this can be related to different sensory needs. The next sense that we're going to talk about is interoception, and this relates to the internal state of the body. So, for example, noticing perhaps when we're hungry, thirsty, and our body temperature, so knowing if we're too hot or too cold, and then adjusting to this. So autistic individuals may experience difficulties with their interoception and may experience some of the examples on the slide. So, for example, they may perhaps always be hungry, or the opposite, never be hungry. And that relates back to that interoceptive sense, in that it's not processing the information it's receiving to notice those bodily feelings. So your child may say that they're always hungry without noticing that their body actually isn't hungry. Again, the next one is difficulty regulating body temperature. So the interoceptive sense is responsible for noticing when our bodies become too hot or too cold, and then adjusting to this. So, for example, putting a coat on if we're too cold, or taking items of clothing off when we are too hot. So, when not enough information is reaching this sense, then a child may not be able to tell when their body temperature is changing, and then won't react to this in an appropriate way. Um, Need for the bathroom, or not knowing when they need to go until it's really, really urgent. So again, that comes back to noticing those bodily feelings that we experience, and that comes from that interoceptive sense. So you may have to prompt your child and just say, "Do you need to go to the toilet?" And they may turn around and say no because they're not getting those sensations. But actually, if you put them on the toilet, then they may need to go. And again, the opposite, not knowing until it's very urgent, until literally they're about to go. They haven't got that urge and that feeling that we may experience in our body. So all of those examples relate back to that interoceptive sense. Um, so I think that's just something really important to hold in mind, because I think it's a sense that we don't really always touch on, but I think it gives a great explanation for some of these behaviours that are on the slide. So next I'm going to touch on a sensory meltdown, as this is a term that you may have heard of or may have come across, or something that you may have even used to explain your own child's responses to a situation. So when there is an overload of sensory information, so for example, in a situation where there may be loud noises, bright lights, lots of people talking, different smells all at one time, so similar to that video I showed you at the beginning, this can make it difficult for an autistic individual to process all of this sensory information and modulate a appropriate response. So this could then result in a sensory meltdown, and this may be displayed in different ways depending on the child. So firstly, we have the fear, fight or flight response. So fear relates to perhaps blood pressure increasing, you might see flushing in the face, respiration, so sweating, perhaps fast breathing, and the child's vocalization may increase. So that's one response to these sensory overload. We then have flight, so perhaps your child might be displaying behaviours such as running away. That's a loss of eye contact, pushing away people. They just want to remove themselves from that situation. Another response is the fight response. So this is where we may see perhaps self-aggression towards a self, so perhaps self-harming, or even towards other people, so lashing out at parents, maybe hitting other people, or destruction of property. So these are all ways of trying to manage that sensory overload. So alternatively, you may see your child rock or spin, perhaps screaming, putting their hands over their ears, all these other ways to try and block out some of the sensory information that they are receiving, or they may shut down altogether and try and withdraw. So therefore, if you see any of these behaviours in your child, it's worth looking at the environment around your child and just reviewing whether sensory information may have overloaded your child, and what can you do to try and reduce this sensory overload. And again, just going back to those sensory extremes, so we've spoken about the difference between hypersensitivity and hypersensitivity. And it's just bearing in mind some of those extreme behaviours that we may see in children. So hyposensitivity, this may give rise to craving for extreme sensations. So for example, this could be as extreme as head banging, because they need that level of force to feel something due to their sensory touch system being undersensitive. Hypersensitivity, so too much information getting into the processing system. This may give rise to an overreaction to common or familiar experiences. So, for example, if someone lightly touched your child on the arm, this could feel really painful for the child and will result in sort of an overreaction to this behaviour or this action. So it is also important to note that the consistency of perception may be different on different occasions. So therefore, there may be situations where your child does not react at all. They may be able to tolerate these senses much more on certain days compared to other days, or it may vary in terms of different types of situations that they are. So they may be able to tolerate these senses or the sensory information when they're at home in an environment where they feel safe and the sensory information is quite controlled. Whereas at school or perhaps out in a public setting, they may not tolerate these the sensory information as much, and it may be perceived as more overwhelming for them. So it's just useful to hold this in mind that sensory information can cause these extreme behaviours, and also that this may vary across different times of day, different settings, or even across their age. As they get older, they may learn to tolerate things more, or find that as they get more exposed to sensory information, that they may learn that some noises or perhaps some senses they're more oversensitive to. And here is a table of both hypersensitive and hyposensitive behaviours that you may have noticed your child displaying, or perhaps you may want to look out for which are related to the sensory environment. I just like to show this because there are behaviours on here that perhaps you wouldn't always attribute to the sensory environment, and I just think it's really useful to hold in mind. So I now wanted to have a think about some strategies that we could put into place to help support your children. So firstly, we want to be thinking about the work questions. So that is what, when, where, who and why. And this will help us to think about what is going on for your child at that moment in time. So we'll be thinking about what happened at that situation, when did it happen? So think about the time of day, where did it happen? So the environment that's around your child. Who was there? Perhaps too many people or people they did not feel secure and safe with. And finally, why? Why did your child display that behaviour? Answering the work questions will help us to get the answer as the why answer, and to help explain why your child perhaps responded in a certain way. So things we can do to help answer these are looking at the environment. If this needs adjusting to meet your child's needs, then think about how can this be done. So we could gradually desensitize your child to an environment. So for example, having them in a particular environment for a short amount of time and then building this up over time. So we also need to think about the experiences and the activities that we are offering your child and then look at this from their perspective. So will this activity be too noisy? Perhaps it's a messy task and they don't like getting their hands dirty. By taking a moment to think about how they may feel and putting ourselves in their shoes, we can prevent an activity being given to them which may cause a sensory overload. So we then want to think about how can we adapt an activity to avoid this sensory overload. Perhaps the use of ear defenders to block out some noises, or smaller group work to reduce some of this noise. So some solutions can be very simple, but can make a great deal of difference to your child. So we always like to say, choose your battles. So if your child is responding in a way that is loud and disruptive, then what is going to be gained from insisting that they follow through with this activity? Is this the right time? Or perhaps we try the activity at a different time when they appear more calm and content. But like I always say, you are the experts of your children and you will know their limits and their state of mind when they are calm, when they're content. So trust your gut instinct and your judgment around your child. Here is another video from the National Autistic Society to outline how the sensory information that we perceive each day may be interpreted by someone with autism. So I like to show these videos as I think it gives a great representation of what a child with autism may be experiencing and how difficult it can be to process information from different senses all at one time. And I think that video is a great way at highlighting how oversensitive a child with autism sensory system can be. So thinking back to those examples of the tap dripping and the clock ticking, these may be sounds that perhaps people without autism don't pick up and don't even notice, they just blend into the background. But just noticing how highlighted these are to a child with autism can be really beneficial when you're thinking about the environment around them. If you would like any further information in understanding how overwhelming the sensory environment is, then please do go to Google and type in NAS Sensory video, and this will produce more links with further information around this topic. So I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about an analogy that we like to use to help think about the children that we work with and in relation to their sensory systems. So we like to imagine that our body is like a car engine. Sometimes we run on low, perhaps when we're tired. Sometimes we run on high when we're excited, and sometimes just right. So we want to start thinking about the different points in the day and when we're at these different levels. So this is something that we can sit down and think about, especially in relation to your child. So stage one is to begin to notice in your child at what points of the day are they low, just right, or high, as this will help us to think about what exercises and activities you can put into place to help manage your child's car engine and their sensory system. So for example, if they are low in the mornings, you could think about having a high energizing activity to get them going and get their energy levels rising. Or perhaps if they're running on a high when they return from school, we can think about some calming down activities before we perhaps engage them in after school homework. You want them to have some quiet time. But before we think about those activities, a good starting point is to notice these lows and highs within your child's routine. And perhaps do these vary as the week goes on? Are they running on more of a low by the time they get to Friday because they're more tired? So maybe just take some time to think about your child and your child's engine and different points of the day and the routine where you might notice that these are fluctuating. Once you have identified the car engine stages, then sensory motor methods can be introduced to help alter the car engine. So there may be some trial and error in this. One thing may work one day and not on another, but it's all about perseverance and ensuring a consistent approach is taken. So although perhaps one calming down exercise doesn't work after school, this may be because your child isn't used to doing this. They're used to coming in and just being able to, release all their energy in their own way. But trying to keep it structured, it's going to take a little while to get into this new routine. So try and persevere and keep it going, even if it feels like your child isn't engaging in these methods. So we'll now go on to think about how we can alter that car engine and those different levels of your child and introduce those sensory motor methods that I mentioned on the previous slide. So we will look at these in relation to the senses that we have discussed throughout this presentation. So ideas may consist of movement, perhaps looking at something, getting your child to listen to music or audio, putting something in their mouth like a chew toy, or perhaps touching something that is quite soft and relaxating for them. So ways to change your car engine will all relate to those different senses that we have discussed. So firstly, let's start with movement. So if your child's car engine is running on a low, you may want to think about including some of the movement activities into their daily routine to help increase their energy level. So thinking about, rotary circles, so moving arms in circles, jumping up and down, running back and forward. So just getting those sort of high energy activities going to help increase that energy. And I think movement has such beneficial effects on both mental health well-being and physical well-being. So trying to engage some level of exercise into your child's routine can be really beneficial. And it might be a case that this can be quite flexible. So you just do one activity in the morning or after school if they need to get their energy back up. Or this can be quite structured. So thinking about a sensory circuit with different movement ideas in. So thinking about they have to, hop down the hallway, then jump through the kitchen, running on the spot in the lounge. So you can, think about those sensory circuits around the house. And movement is just a great way of trying to increase those energy levels. So the next sense that we'll look at is the visual sense and how this can be used to alter that sensory motor in your child. So first of all, we've got visual input and ideas. So things like opening and then closing window shades. So again, if your child is perhaps running on high, closing those window shades and making the room a bit darker and calmer can be really beneficial. Or perhaps if they're running on low, you may want to open those windows to bring in more light to make them feel more alert and awake. Again, watching a fireplace, perhaps watching a fish tank, sunset, sunrise, these are all very calming activities which can be used to help reduce your child's engine, especially if they're running on a high. And thinking about those times when you want them to calm down before bedtime, trying to get them to engage in perhaps these calming visual activities can be a real positive in help calming them down before that bedtime routine. And just thinking about how do you react to different visuals? So dim lighting. So I know personally, dim lighting for me can automatically make me feel sleepy. It signals sort of that end of the day, that nighttime feeling. So and that relates to, in a way, tiredness. And the opposite, fluorescent lighting is very bright, it's quite harsh on the eyes. And again, that can make me feel more alert and awake. So just thinking about perhaps how you react to different visual systems, and it could be likely that your child will react in the same thing, in the same way. Um, Again, sunlight through bedroom window when sleeping. I think for me that automatically wakes me up, and the day has begun. So it might be thinking about natural light versus artificial light. Would your child feel more alert if they were woken up by natural light? So raising the curtains in the morning rather than turning on the light switch. So I guess, yeah, just thinking about all those different visual senses around your child and how those could be used effectively to alter that, either running that system that's running on high or running on low. Next, we have that auditory sense and listening. So, thinking about the auditory input and ideas that we may come across. So, we have variations in noise level. So, if I think about myself personally, if I want to get myself energized and increase that sensory motor level, then I'm going to turn the radio up loud. I'm going to put the music on at a higher volume than when I'm trying to be calm. So again, just thinking about that with your child, could you put some music on when their engine is perhaps running low, get them energized. But when you perhaps want them calm, keep the volume level to a quieter level. Thinking about variations in rhythm as well. When I think about when I'm walking somewhere and I want to walk quite quickly, I'll always put a fast-paced rhythm song on to walk to, because that automatically gets my body moving quicker. And again, when we think about gym classes and dance classes, they're normally always using songs that are very upbeat. They've got a quick rhythm to get your body moving and energized. However, on the opposite side, when you want to calm down, you're going to play very calming, quite slow, rhythmic music. So again, just thinking about that rhythm of the auditory information that you want them to hear. And thinking about varying the auditory distractions, so things like classical music versus hard rock. So you might want to use classical music when you want to calm down the sensory motor system, and hard rock when you want to increase sensory motor system. So again, just holding in mind all of those different auditory ideas. And also, again, it's useful to think about how you react to different auditory information. So things like scratching on the chalkboards, that can, for some people, that can be like the worst sound in the world and can make you squirm at the sound of it. The squeak of a mechanical pencil, a fire siren, walking down, waking up to an unusual noise, perhaps a dog barking. So these are all noises that we as humans can react differently to, and it's about just bearing this in mind with your child. So something that you might quite enjoy or think is a soothing sound, to a child with autism, that could be the most painful sound that they can hear. So just holding that in mind and thinking about if one sound isn't working for your child, then thinking about possibly changing that, or even asking your child, do you like this noise before you use it? Or getting your child to take ownership of the auditory information that they want to use to calm down or energize themselves. So just holding that in mind about how us as humans, we all react to sounds differently. So next we have the taste sense, or putting something in your mouth. So there's a lot of oral input or ideas that you could use with your child that perhaps you might not have thought about before. So things like drinking a milkshake, the sensation that this is quite cold, it's quite cooling, and again, taking that time to drink a milkshake can be enough time to help calm your child down. Again, sucking on a hard candy or sweets, that could be used as a real calming effect because your child is taking that time to kind of regulate themselves and suck on that sweet. Again, with the ice pieces, and also I think there's something about quite cold ice or a milkshake, things like that, that could be such a cooling and calming effect on a child, especially when they're quite heightened at a time. So I think that's a really good tool to use. Chewing on a pencil and pen. So this is something that we see quite a lot with children with autism, especially perhaps in the classroom environment when they're feeling anxious. Chewing on something like that can be a great release for them. So again, it can be, chewing a pen and the pencil isn't the most ideal um, method, especially thinking about lead and ink. But there's other things like chew toys that perhaps a child might want to use, or again, just using sort of ice pieces and things to help reduce that anxiety, which may be beneficial for them. Taking slow, deep breaths. So again, that's a great way of calming down the body, just helping that emotion regulation and regulating the body back to that baseline level. So that could be a really good tool to use. And again, there's lots of others on the slides that you could use. So um, eating something cold again, like an ice pop, crunching on something, that noise, that sensation, chewing gum as well, so getting sugar free to protect the teeth, that could be as an alternative perhaps for the pencil and pen. And again, and the last one there, drinking a hot chocolate or milk, that's as well has sort of calming effect on the body. So perhaps before bed, that could be in the bedtime routine, just getting them to calm down with a hot drink. So yeah, these are all ideas relating to that taste sense that could be used to alter that sensory motor system. And now this moves us on to our final sense, which is touch. So some tactile inputs and ideas can consist of perhaps twisting hair. So this can be a very calming and soothing action for someone who perhaps is running on a high and needs to just take some time to calm down. And I think that is quite a soothing and safe activity that children can engage in. Moving keys or coins in the pocket with hands. So I think my experience of working with children with autism, having a fidget tool to be able to use, especially when they're feeling a bit anxious or perhaps it's their sensory processing is becoming overloaded in a situation such as the classroom, having something to just fiddle with in their pocket and subtly or in their tray could be a real way of helping them to feel more calm and manage that anxiety while still trying to concentrate with what's going on around them. So yes, I'd really recommend using a something to fidget with, and this can be, there's loads of fidget tools on Amazon or other internet sites, but if you don't want to buy any of those, and that's fine. Simple things like moving keys or coins, and again things like blue tack as well can work just as well. Having a cool shower, so I think that is a great way of energizing the body again as well. So really wake up the child if they're running low. Or the opposite is having a warm bath. So that's quite a calming resource to use, especially again think before that bedtime routine when you want your child to be calm and start to transition into bed and thinking about sleeping. Again, massages, the feeling of touch on the body can be very calming and soothing. But again, this isn't for all children. Some children may really dislike being touched in the form of a massage. So again, just thinking about, your child best. So you make that judgment on what kind of these activities that they prefer the most. Again, petting a dog or a cat, so having a pet, that again can be very soothing and calming. So yeah, if you're lucky to have a dog or a cat, you can really use that to your advantage. And I know a lot of parents do say to me that their bond with a pet is really great, and it helps them to calm down by stroking and looking after that. So again, there's just a couple of other ideas on that slide, but again, all of these can be used to help both energize and increase that sensory motor system, or decrease it when perhaps your engine is running on high. So this is just a nice quote from Wendy Lawson, who has autism, highlighting how difficult and even painful it can be to process and experience sensory information. And I just think this is quite a nice thing to hold in mind and to help understand what someone with autism may be experiencing. So I'll just give you a minute to read that in your own time and take in what she's trying to say. And if you would like any more resources, here are some good resources that focus on sensory differences in children with autism that may be useful for you if you'd like to perhaps research some more information on this topic, or perhaps clarify anything that I've said throughout. So I'd like to say thank you for joining me today, and I hope this has provided you with some useful information regarding sensory processing. Should you have any questions or queries regarding any of the content that has been discussed, then please do contact the Autism Service using the following email address, which is theautismservice@cognus.org.uk, and someone will answer your query. Also, any feedback on the session would be greatly appreciated. The feedback link is below in the comments section, or the description of the online workshop. So that would be greatly appreciated, and help us guide about how we can make these better for future courses. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope that it's been a helpful experience for you.